Good morning. Grace and peace to you all. This is Lieutenant Roger from the Salvation Army in Napa, and this is our weekly worship and study time. I hope that you are well, but well or sick, I pray that you remain faithful. And that is part of the reason we're spending our study time in the book of Daniel right now. That's because the stories of Daniel and his companions in exile are stories of people who found themselves ripped from the world that they knew and loved and dropped into an alien place with alien rules and alien beliefs. And as we look at these ancient histories, it is my contention that we can find evidence of God's continuing love for his people, even in times of exile when they might feel they've been abandoned. Even when we're trapped away from the people and things that we know, God is with us. And we need to keep our focus on the things of God, not on the things of this world. I hope that you've got a Bible handy because I want you to follow along as we look into the eternal meanings behind the popular story that we find in Daniel chapter 3. Now, today I'm going to be using the New Living Translation because I think that it translates some of the parts a little clearer than the NIV text we usually use. If you have a different translation, that should be fine. The major translations may use different words, but they should all reflect the same meaning, which is the part of the story we're really trying to get at whenever we're reading Scripture. I hope by now you've found Daniel chapter 3. We're going to start right in verse 1. King Nebuchadnezzar made a gold statue 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then he sent messages to the high officers, officials, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the provincial officials to come to the dedication of the statue that he had set up. So all of these officials came, and they stood before the statue King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. This, by the way, is the second largest statue recorded in ancient history. The largest was the Colossus of Rhodes that stood about 100 feet tall, although it wasn't going to be built for another 300 years after this. As a point of reference, by the way, the Statue of Liberty is just over 111 feet tall. Even more interesting than its size is the reason why Nebuchadnezzar had built this thing in the first place. Look at verse 4. Then a herald shouted out, "People of all races and nations and languages, listen to the king's command. When you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, or other musical instruments, bow to the ground to worship King Nebuchadnezzar's gold statue. Anyone who refuses to obey will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace." So he built this thing to be worshipped. Why? Well, do you remember how in the last chapter we heard how God had sent Nebuchadnezzar this amazing dream where he and the Babylonian Empire were represented as being a gleaming golden head of a statue? It seems that Nebuchadnezzar might have missed the real importance of what that was all about, and it seems like it may have led him to wanting to have people celebrate him. So he's decreed that they worship his image or die. Simple enough, right? So, verse 7, so at the sound of the musical instruments, all the people, whatever their race or nation or language, bowed to the ground and worshiped the gold statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. I'm going to point out real quick here that all the people is not actually all the people, but we'll get to that. First, we need to remember who these people were. This was all the leaders. The high officers, officials, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the provincial officials, according to verse 2. And yes, I did read that list. I tried to memorize it, but, that's the way it goes. These are the representatives of Nebuchadnezzar's government. These are the leaders who are responsible to carry his will to the people. These are also the first rank of the folks that he expects loyalty from. And this group includes native-born people and conquered exiles alike. And what he's asking them to do is to bow down to this symbol of his power. Now, bowing down, it's not just worship, it's submission. It is a promise of loyalty. It's like declaring a political party or a national allegiance. And under the contract that God had established with his people, it is loyalty that belongs to him, not to any lesser agency or organization or governing body or political party or nation. In fact, that's the first of the first two of the 10 commandments. God says, "Have no gods but me," and "Don't bow down or worship anything but me." And both of those say the same thing. Do not subject yourself to any power except the Lord. Now remember that at this time, Daniel's time, the Jewish people were being held by their enemies. Israel and Judah had been destroyed. The people who had survived had been ripped from their homes and scattered into foreign lands. Why? Because over the generations, even though God had given them many opportunities to turn back, his people had continued to violate the covenant. That was that contract he had established. He said, I will be your God if you will be my people. But they hadn't been his people. Instead, they'd subjected themselves to other gods and other ways of life and other nations until God finally allowed them to become a part of the world that they had so desperately been pursuing. Rather than following his ways, they desperately wanted to be like all the people around them. They wanted to worship the gods the other people did. They wanted to do the things the other people did. They didn't want to listen. They, they broke the covenant. And ultimately, they suffered the consequences for doing so. They were taken away from their country and their temple and from all the other places where they knew their God. And now they were here in Babylon under new management, as it were. And their new king is demanding a show of loyalty. He's demanding that they bow down to demonstrate that they promised to be subject to him in all things. They lined up alongside others who were just like them, people from a lot of different places and beliefs, all who were here in service to this king and this country. And they were told that they could do what was right and live, or they would be rooted out and killed. And then the music played. And as one, the thousands of people stretched out across that plain, put their faces to the ground as they bowed to this symbol of their king. Except not quite all the people. Verse 8. Some of the astrologers went to the king and informed on the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, Long live the king! Literally, this says, May the king live forever! We love you! Just keep living! Verse 10, You issued a decree requiring all the people to bow down and worship the gold statue when they hear the sound of the horn and flute and zither and lyre and harp and pipes and other musical instruments. And that decree also states that those who refuse to obey must be thrown into a blazing furnace. I get the feeling from how this is written, these guys are like consulting a notebook where they'd written down the decree word for word so they could use it as a special scaffold that they could hang someone from. Oh, King, may you live forever because you rock, buddy. Hey, I hang on to your every word, and I heard you say this thing here that anyone who doesn't do it is deep in the weeds. Is that right? Because the thing is, we know some guys who maybe weren't listening as well as I was. Verse 12, There are some Jews, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, whom you have put in charge of the province of Babylon. They pay no attention to you, your majesty. They refuse to serve your gods and do not worship the gold statue you have set up. I want you to take note of something here. In their accusation, they start by making the people that they're accusing a part of a minority group before they even bother to name them or the crime that they're being accused of. The accusers are playing on any natural animosity that they think might be able to get prodded up to the surface. They are not accusing men. They are accusing people who are part of those people. I mean, we all know how much trouble those people are. Well, just as much as those people are a waste of skin, let me tell you about how these guys, who are part of those people, so that you can know that they're even worse than the rest of their ethnic, political, or national group, let me tell you about how these guys are just bad men. So what we have here is Chaldeans saying to their king, hey, we all know the Jews aren't really loyal, but these three are even worse. You know the guys, the ones you gave special favors to, the ones you put in charge of the best province in the nation. Well, they just flipped you off and then they mooned you in public and they said your mother is fat. We don't want to make waves or anything. We just thought you should know. Verse 13 says that then Nebuchadnezzar flew into a rage and ordered that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought before him. And when they were brought in, Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you refuse to serve my gods or to worship the gold statue I've set up? I'll give you one more chance to bow down and worship the statue I have made when you hear the sound of the musical instruments. But if you refuse, you're going to be thrown immediately into the blazing furnace. And then what God will be able to rescue you from my power?" Now, if Nebuchadnezzar seems a little surprised in how he questions these young men, there's a reason for that. After all, instead of being slaughtered, they'd been taken and brought to his court. They'd been trained. He cared for them in a time of need. And they were royal hostages, which meant that their presence in his employ was also a way of ensuring that their families stayed at peace and did not rebel. And so positions like that, they also came with this implied threat that if they weren't loyal, their families would also suffer the consequences of being considered traitors to the king. And these three didn't have menial jobs where they were forced to wait on others in the palace or focus on grudge work or be treated as scribes for rent or anything like that, like a lot of these kind of royal hostages would have been. As a result of the dream interpretation that they and Daniel had accomplished by God's power, they had been given positions of real authority. They were in charge of sections of the royal capital city. They were important men who led and influenced others. Nebuchadnezzar would have seen them doing their jobs. He would have seen that they were loyal in their tasks, or he would have had them removed or killed a long time before. But he would also be aware that their disobedience that they are exhibiting right now probably lay in the observance of their faith. But what he wouldn't have understood is why they wouldn't just set that aside long enough to demonstrate their allegiance to him. He was a king who believed in many gods and he worshiped them, whichever one was in front of him at the time, that was the one to worship, and the other one, you could just put him aside. After all, he and his gods had conquered Israel, so obviously these three guys had nothing to rely on here. I mean, what God could possibly rescue them from the punishment that was laid before him? He and his gods were represented by a 90-foot idol, after all. No one else had that. These guys didn't have anything like that. They were captives. Why not just show their loyalty to him and be done with it? That's what most people would do given the choice, right? Verse 16, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you. If we're thrown into the blazing furnace, the God whom we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power, your majesty. But even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, your majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue you've set up." I want to point out this is not a disrespectful or an arrogant reply. Culturally, they're simply saying there's no argument here. They're not going to be subject to the king's gods or to his big gold statue. The reason that they give is badly translated in the NLT version. So let me read it from the Christian Standard Bible. It captures the essence a little better. This is Daniel 3:17 from the CSB. "If the God we serve exists, then he can rescue us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he can rescue us from the power of you, the king." Now, Nebuchadnezzar had said, practically speaking, "There isn't any God who has greater power over you than I do." So the men replied, "Well, actually, our God can rescue us from the fire or anything else that's in your power to do to us." And then they go on to say, "Hey, even if we burn to ashes, that doesn't change the fact that our loyalty is to God, first and foremost, and always." What might be hard to remember is that in Nebuchadnezzar's worldview, the gods only had power inside of their own borders. Nebu was he was the king, and therefore everyone in his kingdom was subject to his gods, and no outside gods had power in his territory. At least that's what he believed. His gods demonstrated their strength by the victories of the Babylonians over all the surrounding peoples. If any god had power to resist, it surely wouldn't be the God of Judah, because that's a land Nebuchadnezzar had beaten and destroyed every time he visited it. Some god of the slave people who served him was going to save them from whatever fate Nebuchadnezzar had decreed for them. As far as he was concerned, that sort of thing just couldn't happen. But these boys say that it can. And they say that even if their God doesn't choose to prove it at that moment, they choose to follow him, even if it means their death. Nebuchadnezzar is sure that their God is gone, or at least far away from them. They are sure that God is with them, always, even in the worst of all situations. They had a faith that taught them to remain focused on the things of God rather than on the fears or rewards of this world. But what the king understood most of all is that what these three were doing was defying his order, and in a very public way. Verse 19, Nebuchadnezzar was so furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that his face became distorted with rage. He commanded that the furnace be heated 7 times hotter than usual. And then he ordered some of his strongest men in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and to throw them into the blazing furnace. Depending a little on what kind of furnace this was, and we can make some reasonable assumptions based on what we know about the Babylonians, the technology didn't really exist to make it 7 times hotter, at least not in the way that we think of such things. But they probably threw in 7 times as much fuel or just worked the bellows until they got it as hot as they could. And that would have been somewhere between 1300 and 1500 degrees centigrade, or somewhere just on the high side of 2500 degrees Fahrenheit. Roughly 25 times hotter than Arizona in the summer. You want perspective on this? Bodies are cremated in modern times at between 1400 and 1800 degrees Fahrenheit. So the furnace here gets stoked up to about 2500 degrees, while the guards tie these 3 men up to make it easier to pick them up and throw them on top of the glowing bed of coals. And according to Daniel chapter 3, verses 21 through 23, it says they tied them up and they threw them into the furnace, fully dressed in their pants, turbans, robes, and other garments. And because the king, in his anger, had demanded such a hot fire in the furnace, the flames killed the soldiers as they threw the 3 men in. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, securely tied, fell into the roaring flames. It's kind of a harsh image. The flames are where I've felt like I've been thrown for most of the last 2 months. The world around us is burning with fever. We personally have been facing some challenges in our professional life. I feel deeply the weight of responsibility for a dozen staff members where I'm at, dozens of volunteers, along with over 20 students and graduates who are in our program right now. I was desperately looking forward to some vacation time, which obviously hasn't happened and isn't likely to in the coming months. And I'm trying to find ways to keep my kids getting educated and socialized and not just watching YouTube videos all the time. Our congregation is scattered, and because so many people who come to our church are unhomed or technologically impaired or just outside of most of the channels that we use to communicate, I'm so terribly disconnected from most of them. They're a face-to-face group at a time when we're not allowed to be face-to-face. 100 people a week used to come and meet in our building for recovery meetings, but I have no way to know what's happening with most of them, and I don't know if they're staying safe. And it's hard to pray for people when you don't even know their names. And I worry that I'm not doing enough. And I sit on these disaster councils and I hear from health workers and disaster leadership that the worst is yet to come. And then I hear from friends and relatives and news outlets that we all just need to reopen our doors. But I'm also a student of history, and I know that this is exactly the pattern that has been followed in past pandemics, and how opening too early always turns out to be a disaster. And then I get calls from people who want me to tell them that the world is ending and Jesus is coming back. I don't really see that, except maybe I can see that if I squint my eyes just the right way and let my mind wander into the dark corners it likes to visit when my optimism starts to slip away from me. God have mercy. I am standing in the fire and I wonder why it hasn't consumed us all. I can see that it's killed thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands all around us, all burned by the heat of the flames of disease and famine and war and violence and vitriol. And the heat distorts my vision when I look at it, and the flames just threaten to overwhelm me, and I feel scared and I feel alone. But then I remember the story doesn't end with the fire. Verse 24, suddenly Nebuchadnezzar jumped up in amazement and exclaimed to his advisors, "Didn't we tie up 3 men and throw them into the furnace?" "Well, yes, your majesty, we certainly did," they replied. "Look," Nebuchadnezzar shouted, "I see 4 men, unbound, walking around in the fire unharmed, and the fourth looks like a god. Nebuchadnezzar recognized that even though he could see and feel the fire, there was something more going on here, something greater than he had ever imagined was possible. Verse 26 says that then Nebuchadnezzar came as close as he could to the door of the flaming furnace, and he shouted, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. And so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stepped out of the fire. And then the high officers, officials, governors, and advisors crowded around them and saw that the fire had not touched them. Not a hair on their heads was singed, and their clothing was not scorched. They didn't even smell of smoke. They were recovered. Once he had recognized that their God was the Most High, the king acted quickly to recover the men who had refused to serve anyone but that God. The fire that raged around them, the same flames that caused the death of others who'd been alongside them, had only set these men free to worship their God in a greater way than ever before. Because the truth was, they could have been as bold as they liked, but it wasn't until they passed through the fire that they knew the full depth of God's love for them. Even when they were trapped in a furnace, God was right there with them. Whether they had lived or died didn't really matter because they were beloved children of God, and He was with them in their greatest moment of despair and in their greatest triumph just after. And when they came out, they didn't even smell like smoke. Their lives became a revelation to the people around them and to King Nebuchadnezzar as well. In verse 28, it says, Nebuchadnezzar said, Praise to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He sent his angel to rescue his servants who trusted in him. They defied the king's command and were willing to die rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I make this decree. If any people, whatever their race or nation or language, speak a word against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they will be torn limb from limb and their houses will be turned into heaps of rubble. Because there is no other God who can rescue like this. All right, so he may have got a little carried away there with the whole ripping people limb from limb bit. But it was a revelation to Nebuchadnezzar that this God had power. You know what? It can be a revelation to us that God has power. Because what the king said then is still true today. There is no other God who can rescue like this. When we are standing in the fire, God stands with us. Even when you're trapped in a furnace, God stands with you. I warn you, he doesn't promise he's going to save you from the flames. In fact, there's a lot more verses that suggest God uses the fires of life to test and to refine us, to bring us closer to being the people that he created us to be, instead of to protect us from the potential challenges we might find there. Back in the day when I used to have a hobby, I used to go prospecting when I could. It means going out, digging up likely pay dirt and panning it out to find the flakes and the dust and those little tiny nuggets that make up miners' bread and butter, as it were. And when you take everything you find and you put it all together in a vial, it makes a nice shiny bottle to look at. But there's always stuff stuck in there along with the gold. There's bits of black sand, the iron, and the magnetite and other heavy materials that are really hard to separate out with the basic mining tools most people can afford. Sometimes there's bits of garnet or other gemstones in there too. Those are pretty, but they're hard to get out. And the gold itself tends to have impurities in the gold, which means gold found in different locations can actually have different hues. In some places it's more yellow, and others it's more orange, even though it's all gold. But when you take all of that and you put it together in a crucible and you pass it into a furnace, the gold melts and all of those lesser elements burn. And that gold is shaped into what's called a button first, where it's just kind of a little pool of gold at the bottom of the crucible. And then you let it cool. And the carbon that's left from the impurities burning up is called slag. It all rises up to the surface of the button. And then you can pop it out and hit it with a hammer and break that slag loose from the shining treasure that gets left behind. And now you have this pure button that can be passed back into the fire until it melts again. And then it can be poured into a mold, which is going to be its new shape. It's going to be the form in which it will be the most useful for whoever owns it. And pure gold, you can make it into a bar or a coin that are valuable on their own, or it could be a ring or a necklace or some other adornment that just makes the world more beautiful by its existence. Or you could work it into an object of art or spin it into wires that will carry a current or switch signals across the circuit boards of our computers and cell phones. An element like gold that's been refined and made pure has 1,000 uses, 1,000 different purposes that it can fulfill. A person who has been refined and made pure has 1,000 uses, 1,000 purposes that they could fulfill as well. So even as we're trapped in the furnace, being refined by the fires of life, we need to remember God is with us. He's there caring for us. He's removing our defects. He's making us pure so that we can be useful. He burns away the bonds that keep us from being free, and he protects us so that even the smoke from our past won't cling to us. We just need to keep our focus on the things of God and not on the things of this world. Are you with me? Jesus said that we should store our treasures in heaven, where moths and rust cannot destroy, and thieves do not break in and steal. Wherever your treasure is, there the desires of your heart will also be. That's Matthew 6, verses 20 and 21. Store your treasures in heaven, because wherever your treasure is, that's where the desires of your heart will also be. In a world that is on fire, it's time to examine what we treasure and where we expect to find that treasure. What is the true desire of your heart? Is it to do the things of God, or is it to hold on to the things of this world? What is it you're focusing on? And do you need to change that focus? Or does it need to be refined for you so that it can become pure? As we head into another week that's filled with flame, remember that those who walk with God will ultimately find that they are never alone. So let's close with a prayer that can help remind us that we always have hope in the fire. The Lord's Prayer. If you know the words, please feel free to say them along with me. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Lord, guard us from the flames when they come, so that they purify us. Don't let us be destroyed. Remind us you are always with us, and we are never alone. Amen and amen. Grace and peace to you all. If you haven't done so yet, you can hit the subscribe button down at the bottom there if you want to keep getting these messages or at least notified about them. And if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to post them down at the bottom, and we will be happy to address them as soon as I see them. Thank you. Have a great week.